My name is Ellen, and I'm 62 years old. Just a few weeks ago, I officially retired after spending nearly 4 decades as a public school teacher. It wasn't a glamorous career, but it was steady, meaningful work, the kind of life that doesn't make headlines, but quietly build something solid over time. I live alone in the same modest house I bought 20 years ago. I've never married, and for the most part, I've been okay with that. My life has been simple, structured, and above all, mine. I was looking forward to retirement, not for the vacations or parties people talk about, but for the small, quiet joys. Morning walks without rushing, reading in the middle of the day, maybe volunteering at the library. When my co-workers and a few old friends suggested throwing me a retirement party, I hesitated at first. I wasn't looking for a big celebration. But in the end, I agreed. Mostly because it felt like a small way to mark the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. I should have known better. Somewhere along the way, the guest list expanded. My father, of course, insisted on attending. He even offered to help with the planning. Although, I kept things simple. Just a rented hall, some light catering. Nothing fancy. The day of the party, I arrived a few minutes late. I figured it was fine. It wasn't meant to be formal. When I walked through the door, I stopped cold. The decorations weren't about me. Instead of "Happy Retirement, Ellen," there were banners that said, "A New Beginning," and "Love Always Wins." Heart-shaped balloons floated near the ceiling. A large cake sat at the center of the room, and across it, in swirling script, were the words, "Congratulations, Dad and Carla." For a moment, I genuinely thought I had walked into the wrong party. But no, there was my father, grinning ear to ear, his much younger wife on his arm, accepting congratulations from guests who looked awkward, to say the least. I stood there, smiling stiffly, as realization settled deep into my chest like a cold stone. This wasn't my celebration at all. Growing up, it was just my father and me. My mother passed away when I was 7, after a brief illness that no one ever really talked about in detail. One day she was tucking me into bed, and a few short weeks later she was just gone. After that, my father and I moved into a smaller house across town, closer to his work, and life became a lot quieter. He was never cruel. Not in any way you could point to. He put food on the table, kept a roof over our heads, and made sure I had school supplies every year. But love the kind you see other kids basking in, was something I learned to stop expecting early on. His way of parenting was practical, transactional. If I brought home a good grade, I might get a nod over dinner. If I needed help with a school project, he'd say, "Figure it out, it'll be good for you." When I was little, I tried harder. I remember staying up late to draw cards for Father's Day, practicing piano pieces until my fingers ached, hoping he would notice. Sometimes he did, fleetingly, but more often, he'd brush it aside, distracted by something else. As I grew older, I realized that the surest way to avoid disappointment was to expect nothing. There was always someone or something more important than me. When I was 9, it was his coworker, a woman he dated briefly, who didn't like having kids around. I spent a lot of weekends at my neighbor's house during that phase. When I was 14, it was his promotion at work, a celebration I wasn't even invited to attend, and by the time I was old enough to drive, it was the string of girlfriends who floated through our lives, each one showered with attention that I had quietly stopped craving. There were small betrayals all along the way. The year I turned 16, I saved up to get my driver's license, hoping he'd come with me to the DMV. Instead, he gave me $100 and told me to ask a neighbor for a ride. At my high school graduation, he showed up late, sat in the back row, and left before the ceremony ended because he had somewhere to be. By then, I had learned how to fold my feelings small. I celebrated my own milestones with quiet dignity. Honor rolls, scholarships, small victories that belonged only to me. I didn't want to need applause or recognition. I wanted, more than anything, to prove I didn't need anyone at all. Still, there were moments, soft, traitorous moments, when I hoped. When I started college on a full scholarship, I called him from the dorm room, excitement bubbling in my chest. His first words were, "Good. Now you won't need me to pay for anything." When I landed my first full-time teaching job, I told him over lunch. He raised his glass to me, but within minutes, he had steered the conversation toward his new girlfriend and her plans to start a business. It wasn't just neglect. It was something subtler, something harder to name. A constant shifting of the eye. Spotlight away from me, as if my successes were inconvenient. As if my needs were too loud in a room that only had space for him and his next big thing. Through it all, I stayed steady. I built a career. I saved. I paid off my mortgage early. I showed up for others, a way no one had consistently shown up for me. And every time a little crack appeared in the foundation of our relationship, I patched it over with silence. After all, he was my father. And even if he didn't know how to love me the way I needed, wasn't it better to keep the peace? Wasn't it easier to smile at birthdays and holidays, to send polite texts, to avoid the awkwardness of confronting what would never change? I told myself that I had accepted it, that I didn't need anything from him anymore. But standing in that rented hall, looking at the banners and the balloons and the cake that celebrated someone else's future on the day that was supposed to mark my past, I felt all those silent years catch up to me. Every patched-over crack, every swallowed disappointment, every little betrayal that I had told myself didn't matter. They were all still there. They had simply been waiting for me to finally see them. When the idea of a retirement party first came up, I kept my expectations small. A rented hall near my old school, some light catering, sandwiches, fruit platters, nothing over the top. I sent out invitations to a few close colleagues, a handful of former students who had stayed in touch, and some family members out of courtesy, rather than hope. I paid for everything myself, not because I wanted control, but because I didn't want to owe anyone anything. My father, of course, was enthusiastic from the start. Too enthusiastic, really. He insisted he wanted to help, though his version of help quickly turned into strong suggestions. He wanted to invite people I barely knew, business associates of his, neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years, distant cousins I hadn't seen since childhood. He even floated the idea of moving the party to a more elegant venue, hinting that the little community hall I had rented wasn't festive enough for such a big occasion. I politely declined. I thought that would be the end of it. But there were other small signs that things weren't going to unfold the way I had planned. My emails confirming the guest list went unanswered. A week before the party, my father casually mentioned that he had taken care of some decorations, as a surprise. When I tried to get details, he waved me off with a laugh. "You'll love it, Ellen. Trust me." Trust. It's a strange word when you realize you've been handing it out like confetti for years, hoping it might stick somewhere it was never really wanted. The morning of the party, I dressed simply. Navy slacks, a soft cream blouse, a string of pearls my mother had left me tucked around my neck. I felt steady, quietly proud. After decades of work, I was ready to step into a new chapter, not needing applause, but hoping, at least, for a moment of acknowledgement. When I arrived at the hall and walked through the door, that feeling evaporated. Instead of happy retirement, Ellen. The walls were strung with banners that read, "A new beginning. Cheers to love. Fresh starts." There were heart-shaped balloons bobbing along the ceiling. On the long table where I had imagined a modest buffet, there was a 3-tier cake adorned with roses, and scrawled across it in shimmering gold icing were the words, "Congratulations, Dad and Carla." I froze. I scanned the room, as if maybe, Somehow, the right banner would be tucked into a corner, forgotten behind the loud spectacle in front of me. But it wasn't. The guests, the ones I had invited, looked uneasy. Some shifted on their feet. Others offered tight, polite smiles. And at the center of it all was my father, grinning proudly, his new wife clinging to his arm like a prize on display. Someone thrust a glass of champagne into my hand. Someone else patted my back and said, "You must be so happy for them." I nodded. I smiled. Somewhere, far away inside myself, I nodded and smiled. Then came the speeches. I don't remember who it was. One of my father's old friends, maybe. But someone stepped up to the microphone and began with a line that still echoes in my memory. "We're gathered here today because of Ellen. Without her, none of us would be here." For half a heartbeat, I thought maybe he meant it. Maybe there would be a moment for me. But then he laughed, a practiced, comfortable chuckle, and pivoted effortlessly into a speech about my father's beautiful new journey, about love finding us when we least expect it, about the joy of second chances. There was barely a sentence acknowledging my decades of hard work, my quiet perseverance, my life. Instead, the night turned into a celebration of my father's new marriage, his new beginning, his endless ability to reframe the narrative so that he was always at the center. I stood there, clutching my glass, feeling invisible, not just overlooked, but erased. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. That wasn't how I was built. But inside, something fundamental shifted, a slow, deliberate unhooking from the idea that this would ever change, that he would ever see me as something more than a convenient backdrop for his own spotlight. The ache was sharp, yes, but underneath it was something else. A deep, bone-tired clarity. I had spent a lifetime folding myself smaller and smaller to fit into the narrow spaces he left for me. And now, standing in a room I had paid for, at a party I had planned, watching him take center stage in my own story, I realized there was no space left for me at all. As I stood there at the party, feeling the familiar numbness crawl up my spine, an old memory rose up, unbidden. I was 16 the first time I truly understood what it meant to celebrate. Alone. That year, I had worked harder than I ever thought possible. Late nights studying, extra credit projects, and every spare hour poured into academics. When the results came in, I had earned the highest marks in the entire district, something rare enough that the school decided to hold a special award ceremony for me and a handful of other students. I was proud. Quietly, carefully proud. I had written the date on the calendar weeks in advance, circled it in a bright red pen. I bought a new dress with my own babysitting money. I even asked my father timidly if he could come. He said he would. He promised. The night of the ceremony, I waited at the door, my hair done, the certificate letter clutched in my hand, feeling something small and foolish and very precious blooming in my chest. The minutes ticked by. The clock struck 6. Then 6:30. Then 7. Finally, I called his office. The secretary told me, in the kindest voice she could manage, that he had left early that afternoon. Something about catching a flight to meet a friend for a weekend getaway. I still went. To the ceremony, I accepted my award under the harsh gymnasium lights, the applause echoing in my ears like something hollow. Afterward, I stood in the parking lot, my certificate pressed flat against my chest, and watched the other students pile into cars with their families, laughter spilling out into the night. I walked home. It wasn't a long walk, maybe 20 minutes. But by the time I reached the porch, that small, foolish hope inside me had curled into something harder, something colder. That night, I learned how to carry my pride quietly, how to tuck my joy away where no one else could touch it, or ignore it. It wasn't the only time. Years later, when I earned my first real promotion, assistant principal at a school I'd worked at for over a decade, I decided once again to try. I invited my father to dinner, a small local restaurant, nothing flashy. I even called ahead to make sure they had his favorite wine. When he arrived, he wasn't alone. He brought a woman I had never met. Someone new, someone fresh, someone exciting. I swallowed my surprise and smiled, because what else was there to do? Over the course of the meal, I tried to steer the conversation back to my promotion, to the work I was so proud of. But somehow, every topic ended with her business ideas, her hobbies, their plans to travel. By dessert, it was clear. My news was an afterthought, an accessory to the evening, like the background music no one really listens to. I went home that night and hung the congratulatory plaque on my wall, right next to the others. Another silent trophy in a life full of muted victories. Looking back now, standing in that hijacked party hall, I realized something sharp and undeniable. It wasn't that I had never been enough. It was that I had spent my whole life performing, a version of enough that didn't matter to him. Strength, resilience, independence. These were the things I built my life around. But in his world, visibility only came from novelty, from excitement, from being the newest, loudest thing in the room. And I was never going to be new enough, loud enough, dazzling enough to command that spotlight. I had spent decades mistaking endurance for connection, believing that if I just stayed steady enough, loyal enough, quiet enough, he would finally turn and see me. He hadn't, and he wasn't going to. The truth was as simple and as heavy as that. I don't know exactly when the decision formed inside me. Maybe it had been forming for years, in the quiet erosion of birthdays unattended, achievements unacknowledged, hopes unmet. But standing there in that brightly lit hall, surrounded by faces I barely knew, celebrating a story that wasn't mine, I felt something settle into place. A kind of stillness. A knowing that no apology, no explanation, no desperate hope would ever change what had always been. I set my half-empty glass down on a nearby table. My heart was steady, not angry, not broken, just finished. I made my way to the small stage, at the front of the room. It wasn't much, a slight rise in the floor, a microphone on a thin metal stand. Someone noticed me walking up and quickly lowered the music. The room quieted, expectant. I took the microphone in my hand. It was lighter than I thought it would be. I looked out at the crowd, faces turning toward me, some smiling, some looking awkward, uncertain. I found my father's face easily. He was standing with his arm draped around Carla's shoulders, both of them flushed from champagne and attention. He smiled when he saw me. A big, magnanimous grin, like a king surveying his court. I smiled back. Small, steady. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice carrying easily in the stillness. "Thank you all for coming tonight. It means more to me than you know to see so many faces gathered here." A few people clapped politely. Most just watched, waiting. I let the silence linger for a moment before continuing. I planned this evening as a way to mark a milestone in my life. After 37 years as an educator, I'm stepping away from the classroom. Retirement is a funny word. It sounds like an ending, but in many ways, it's a beginning. I shifted the microphone slightly, anchoring myself to the moment. "And beginnings," I said gently, "deserve to be chosen, to be honored, to be made entirely our own." There was a murmur through the crowd, a ripple of unease. I kept my gaze calm, my tone even. I realized tonight that I owe myself something I've never properly claimed, my own story. I glanced toward my father, and for the first time I truly saw him. Not the man I wished he would be, not the father I had quietly ached for, but simply a man. Flawed, limited, bound by needs I no longer had to center. So tonight, I said, I'm not just retiring from work. I'm retiring from seeking validation where it was never meant to be found. The words hung there, weighty and precise. A woman near the back lowered her glass. Someone shifted uncomfortably at one of the tables. I smiled again, softer this time. I've purchased a home, I continued, in a small town a few states away. Quiet, green, the kind of place where no one knows my history, and no one expects me to fit into a story that never really had space for me. I heard a small gasp from someone near the front. From the corner of my eye, I saw Carla glance sharply at my father, her expression tightening. I pressed on, steady as stone. I'll be moving there next month, and while I'll carry my memories with me, the good and the hard, I won't be carrying old obligations. A beat of silence. This is not a goodbye rooted in anger, I said quietly. It's a beginning rooted in self-respect. I stepped back from the microphone, giving the room a small nod. There was no grand finish, no dramatic gesture. Just the simple, undeniable truth of a woman choosing herself. For a long moment, the room remained frozen. Then, scattered applause, awkward, unsure, echoed weakly off the walls. I caught glimpses of faces, some startled, some awkwardly supportive, some simply confused. I didn't wait for more. I walked down the small steps, moving past the stunned faces, past the glittering banners, past the celebration that had never been mine. I didn't look for my father's reaction. I didn't look back at all. I stepped out into the cool night, the door swinging shut behind me with a soft, decisive click. The parking lot was mostly empty. Above me, the sky stretched wide and endless, a deep navy canopy pricked with stars. I drew in a slow breath, feeling the weight lift from my chest with each step I took away from the building. For the first time in my life, the future felt like mine. Not something I had to ask permission for. Not something I had to earn by shrinking or performing or waiting to be chosen. Just mine. Completely and quietly mine. And as I walked to my car, keys swinging loosely from my hand, I realized leaving didn't mean losing anything. It meant finally, fully, coming home to myself. The weeks after the party moved quietly, like a tide pulling back from the shore. There was no explosion, no dramatic fallout, just a series of small silences, missed calls I didn't return, text, messages I read and then set aside, invitations to lunch or coffee that I politely declined without explanation. I packed my house one box at a time. Books first, then the framed photographs, the ones I chose to keep, the ones that told the story of my life as I had lived it, not as it had been witnessed. I donated furniture that had never felt quite mine. I gave away clothes I no longer needed. Each decision felt lighter than the last. Each empty shelf, each cleared closet, made space for something new I couldn't yet name. When moving day arrived, I drove out of the city before sunrise. The highway stretched ahead of me, quiet and open. I didn't blast music or make grand speeches to myself. I simply drove, feeling the landscape change around me, watching as the urban skyline gave way to fields, then hills, then quiet, winding roads lined with trees. My new home was modest, a small single-story cottage with a wraparound porch and a garden that had been left wild and tangled, waiting for someone to tend it. The first night I slept there, it rained. Soft, steady rain tapping against the roof, against the windows, like a blessing whispered in a language I didn't need to understand. I woke up the next morning to birdsong and the scent of damp earth, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel the weight of anyone else's expectations pressing against my skin. The family reached out occasionally, an email from a cousin, a voicemail from an aunt. Even my father tried once, a short message asking if I had settled in, saying he hoped to hear from me. I didn't respond. Not out of anger, not out of spite. but because some distances aren't a punishment. They are protection. And in this new chapter, I wasn't willing to trade my peace for proximity to people who had never truly seen me. I filled my days slowly. I joined the local library and signed up for a book club, a small group that met every Thursday evening in a sunlit back room, where we drank tea and talked about stories that didn't ask us to perform. I started tending the garden, pulling up weeds, planting new seeds. There was a quiet satisfaction in the dirt under my fingernails, in the steady work of coaxing life from the ground. I took long walks on country roads, nodding to neighbors I didn't yet know, breathing in air that tasted clean and unfamiliar. Didn't reinvent myself. I didn't need to. I simply allowed myself to be, without apology, without adjustment, without waiting for someone else's approval to make my life feel real. Strength, I realized, isn't always loud. Sometimes, strength is the decision to choose silence over arguments, distance over resentment, solitude over hollow connection. Sometimes, strength is simply walking away and not looking back. There are still moments when the old ache stirs, when I catch myself wondering if he thinks about me, if he regrets anything, if he even understands what he lost. But those moments pass more easily now. They are like brief clouds drifting across a wide open sky, noticed, acknowledged, and then left to move on without disturbing the horizon. I live quietly now, but within that quiet, there is a fullness I never knew to hope for, a richness woven not from grand victories or dramatic revelations, but from small, steady choices made every single day, to stay, to grow, to protect the life I have built, and, in the gentle stillness of my new home, with the garden blooming slowly under my care, I know this. I did not lose anything by walking away. I reclaimed everything that matters.